Dear learners, welcome to the second module. In this module, we are going to talk about the current status of the AFCFTA agreement, what we have achieved, what remains to be done. Obviously, what remains to be done will be treated separately in the next module, but already we are going to mention the pending issues in this. In terms of the learning objectives, I would expect you that by the end of this module, you would know what has been achieved so far by the AFCFTA negotiations and what remains to be done. I would expect you to understand the broad objectives and the core principles underlying the agreement. I would expect you to be able to describe and critically analyze the main protocols of the AFCFTA agreement and the protocol relating to the free movement of persons, which, as I will explain, is a separate protocol. So it is not really a part of the AFTA negotiations, it's rather separate. And finally, I would expect you to be able to explain, understand and explain how the AFCFTA agreement conforms to the general spirit of the WTO and of the WTO rules and regulations. If you look at the timeline at the bottom of this slide, you would see that the negotiations actually started in June 2015 at the 25th summit of the EU. Okay? That was when the negotiations were. And if you look at the next point, March 2018, at the 10th Extraordinary Summit, the agreement, the AFCFTA agreement, was signed by 45 member states. So already that marks an important milestone. March 2018, in less than 3 years from the start of the negotiations, the agreement was already signed. I think it's a remarkable achievement. Okay? Because if you look at it elsewhere, in other countries, in other regions, where they have tried to do similar negotiations leading to the regional agreement, it has taken much longer. If you look at Europe, from the signing of the Treaty of Rome until the launch of the European Union, it has taken almost 50 years. Okay? So I think the fact that the negotiations were concluded in such a short period of time itself is testimony to the interest that African policymakers and negotiators have on the continent. As I mentioned also in the first module, trading under the agreement officially started at the beginning of this year, on 1st January. And that also is significant because it started with only a 6-month delay. The launch of trading was initially scheduled for 1st of July 2020. And because of the pandemic, that date was postponed to 1st January. Only 6 months. I'm saying only 6 months because, given this pandemic and the extraordinary situation that it has created, it is really remarkable that the process will be made by only 6 months. So, as I said, this demonstrates appetite for and commitment to the agreement by all parties. In fact, the date for the start of negotiation of trading was pressed for by the business community. We were actually pushing for the delay to be shortened as much as possible and for the launch of trading not to be delayed even further. So that demonstrates the interest that these stakeholders hold for the EFCFTA. The next step involves implementing the agreement. Obviously, this is where the crux of the matter lies, because we have seen in the past that signing an agreement is one thing, but implementing is another. We have seen a number of cases, especially at the level of regional economic communities, where countries have taken commitments, but then when it came to implementing them, they backed down. Some of them started implementing, and then they backpedaled. So there were reversals and delays, and some commitments were actually never made. So the hope is that with the African continental free trade area, countries will show stronger commitment and that they will implement agreement and the stage of the agreement. Much remains to be done. In particular, we need to finalize schedules of concession for goods, schedules of specific commitment for services. We need to finalize rules of origin. In fact, rules of origin were probably the single most important area which slowed down negotiations in the first place. And in fact, rules of origin are still being negotiated, and still being finalized. Okay? So it's a contentious issue. It's been the most contentious area, if you look at it. And negotiations on rules of origin remain ongoing. The seventh thing that needs to be done, obviously, is to expand ratifications. As you know, 54 countries have signed the agreement and they must ratify it. But so far, only 35 countries have ratified it. So there is some way to do it. And we need to ensure effective implementation. I think I need to say it. And finally, but not least, the second phase of the negotiations. Okay. The second phase of the negotiations were in fact meant to be concluded by the end of 2020. But obviously, the negotiations were delayed by the pandemic. In the first step, it was decided to try to finalize everything by the end of June 2021, this year. But again, things have been delayed further, and now I think we are looking forward to at least another year before phase two negotiations are concluded. Let's look at the structure of the EFCFTA agreement. The agreement is conceived in three layers. The first layer consists of the framework agreement. It defines the purpose of the agreement, it states its objectives and guiding principles, and it lays out the institutional framework for implementing it. The second layer is the substantive layer of the agreement. It consists of the protocols of the various protocols that constitute the agreement. So far, as we mentioned, 3 protocols have been concluded. Those are the protocols on trading goods, the protocol on trading services, and the protocol on dispute resolution. In phase 2, 4 areas will be looked at, namely investment, competition policy, intellectual property rights, and the fourth one, which somehow is not appearing on the slide, but the fourth one is e-commerce. Okay? So those are the areas in which negotiations are currently ongoing. And the third layer is the fine print of the agreement. So it consists of all the annexes and the guidelines schedules to protocols, providing very detailed information, really the fine print. They are an integral part of the agreement. Sometimes we tend not to look at them, but that's where sometimes the most important information is. So they are very much an integral part of the. Let's look at the objectives and the core principles of the EFCFTA. The general objectives are laid out in Article 3 of the agreement. Probably the most important objective is the creation of a single market for goods and services facilitated by the movement of persons. And this is envisaged in the Agenda 2063. We'll talk about this more later. Another objective, which obviously follows from the first, is to lay the foundation for a continental customs union, which is really the next step in the process. Okay? Once we have a free trade area, the next step is the customs union. So that is naturally the next step in this process of continental integration. Another important objective is to address the problem of overlapping memberships. We mentioned this in the first module. Remember, we used the term spaghetti ball to refer to this situation where you have a country belonging to more than one regional economic community, more than one trade bloc. And that creates a number of issues when it comes to implementation. Because sometimes different regional economic communities may have different commitments. We may have different commitments with respect to different regional blocks, and implementing them when you are a member in different regional economic communities, you may sometimes go in different directions, they may not be aligned. So that creates a lot of confusion. And then you have the broader objective. Okay, why are we pushing for continental integration? Why are we negotiating for the EFCFTA? Okay? And the answer is simple. We want to promote sustainable development on the continent. We want African economies to be more competitive. We want to promote industrial development. We want to promote structural transformation. Again, this mantra, you have heard it before. It's been there for years now, but for some reason they have to rather use it. Few countries have been able to achieve industrial diversification. Few countries have been able to achieve structural transformation. Very, very few countries. The problem of economic resilience is still very much there. Many countries still are very vulnerable. Many more countries are still very fragile. Okay? And I think the pandemic has highlighted this fragility and lack of economic resilience. So the EFCFTA is seen as a means for African economies to build economic resilience and to achieve some degree of transformation. The specific objectives are what do we need to do in order to contribute to the general objectives? What do we need to do in order to achieve the general objectives? What do we need to do? We need to eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers. We need to progressively liberalize trading services. We need to promote cooperation in all trade-related matters, customs matters, trade facilitation. We need to establish a mechanism for the settlement of disputes, and we need to establish an institutional framework for the implementation of the PFC. So these are the specific objectives. Okay. So these are so the specific objectives are the things that would contribute to the general objective. And finally, the core principles, which are laid out in Article 5 of the AFCFTA agreement. First of the core principles is that the AFCFTA agreement is member-driven. Okay? Each country is sovereign. No country is being forced into this. Okay? But the process remains member-driven. We are not being driven by someone else. There is no external influence. Okay, this is very much Africa's process led by African countries, and African countries are driving the process. The second core principle is variable geometry. Okay? A variable geometry is all about flexibility. It's all about spatial and differential treatment. The idea being that not all countries are at the same level of development. Some countries are more advanced in Africa, as you may know. Of the 54, 55 countries, 33 countries are what are called LDCs, least developed countries. Okay? And these countries are more vulnerable. They have weaker economic structures. They have institutional shortcomings. So, for various reasons, these countries need more time to implement any commitments that they have undertaken with respect to the CFTA. The variable geometry allows for this. Okay, the variable geometry basically means that different countries will implement their commitments at different speeds. You don't want to put every country in the same box. That would be an impossible task. If we were to force that, the agreement would most likely break apart. Another core principle is transparency and disclosure. Okay, we want the process to be transparent. We want countries to disclose, for example, when it comes to implementation, what has been implemented. Okay, so there must be transparency in terms of what is going on. Okay? So everybody knows which country is where in terms of its implementation. The first core principle is the preservation of the acquis. What this means is that the AFCFTA it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about building on what is already there. As you know, Africa is no stranger to regional integration. Regional integration processes on the continent abound, and they have been around for many years. So the AFCFTA is building on what has been achieved in terms of regional integration. So the process is building up. So that is that is what we mean by the acquis. The acquis is what is already there, and the current agreement that we build on. The other core principles obviously follow from the WTO, the principle of most favored nation, national treatment, reciprocity. So this is all about ensuring fairness, ensuring that we are all treating member countries fairly and without any bias and without any extra preference accorded to one member other than. And the idea of substantial liberalization. Any regional trade agreement has to achieve a degree of liberalization that will qualify it under the WTO rules to report itself as a regional trade agreement. Okay? So we'll come to this idea. the substantial liberalization. What is substantial liberalization? It's a bit open to interpretation, but I think by and large, it is agreed that substantial liberalization means at least 90% of tariffs on goods have been removed. Okay. And then consensus in this. Okay. So the whole process is a consensual process. As I mentioned earlier, there is no forcing, there is no fisting. We recognize that different countries have their own shortcomings, their own weaknesses. So the process recognizes all these challenges, and the idea is that we want to forge ahead and we want to do that together. So consensus remains critical to the entire. Okay, what I will do now in the next 4-5 slides is to talk about each of the protocols, okay, that we have agreed on, starting with the protocol on trading goods. This protocol came into effect on 1st January 2021. Okay. That was the date when trading under the AFCFTA agreement officially started. Okay. The key objective of the protocol, as originally envisaged, was to double intra-Africa trade by 2020. Obviously, I'm sure you understand that this objective now needs to be revisited in light of the pandemic. The pandemic has taken many countries back. The pandemic has really also hurt intra-Africa trade quite. So this objective, resistance, I don't think it applies to me. But I think the general objective remains, and that is to substantially increase intra-Africa trade. Okay, as we saw in the first module, intra-Africa trade is 15.5%, meaning Africa trades among other African countries. The amount of trade that Africa undertakes with relative to other countries is only 15 to 16%, meaning that most of the trade taking place is with countries outside of the continent. Okay. So there is much to be done. The scope is there, and a key objective of the protocol on trading goods, therefore, is to substantially increase intra-Africa trade. The protocol on trading goods consists of 32 articles and 9 annexes. Obviously, in this course, we won't be able to go into each one of those articles and annexes in detail. I have sort of identified a few of the articles that I believe are the most important ones. So I will take you through. Article 7 is about trade liberalization. Okay. Article 7 of the protocol obligates state parties to progressively eliminate import duties and equivalent charges. I think it's important that we pay a little bit of attention to the language here. Progressively eliminate. So the idea is to substantially reduce tariffs with a view to eliminating them. Okay? With a view to eliminating them. But then this idea of substantial liberalization means that you do not have to achieve 100% liberalization. If you can do that, that would be great, but it's not a requirement. In fact, in the AFCFTA agreement, what has been agreed is that countries would aim for a 90% liberalization of tariff lines. Okay? 90% of tariff lines are to be liberalized within 5 years by developing countries, and within 10 years by LDCs, by the least developed. So this is the idea of variable GDP. The fact that the least developed countries have a longer period to implement the concepts. In this particular case, we have 10 years to liberalize 90% of the tariff lines, as compared to just 5 years to other developed countries. The remaining 10% of tariff lines are designated either as sensitive products, so 7% are designated as sensitive products, and 3% as excluded products. Okay, so basically, excluded products are products on which you are not going to undertake any liberalization. Sensitive products are products which you will liberalize, but you will take a longer period to liberalize. Okay? So the phase down horizons for sensitive products are long. And they're called sensitive products. I think you can get the idea, because these are products that many countries obviously consider sensitive for various reasons. They may be sensitive from the point of view of local industry. So you might have an industry producing this product, and you are there is a sort of fear that if you open up too suddenly, you will cause injury to your local. In other words, you will be exposing the local industry to competition from abroad, and the industry will not be able to survive. It will be forced to close down, leading to unemployment and tensions. In some countries, some products may be regarded as sensitive from a revenue point of view. Okay, for example, in Seychelles, you would be surprised. In Seychelles, cars are considered, motor vehicles are considered sensitive. Sensitive in what sense? Sensitive because Seychelles, it turns out, actually collects quite a bit of tariff revenue from motor vehicles. So for them, liberalizing tariffs on motor vehicles would mean losing a large chunk of government revenue. So they want to play safe. They want to do in more control. The protocol allows for other exceptions, notably what are called trade remedies. We'll come to that later. Another article is about rules of origin. So rules of origin in any trade agreement is are central to ensuring the validity of the trade agreement, to ensure that the trade agreement remains effective and that it doesn't lead to what is called trade deflection. Okay? So they ensure that only goods that were made in member countries actually benefit from trade. Otherwise, it may become, easy for a member country to import a product cheap from a country that is not a member of the trade bloc, and then just change the label and pass it off as if it was made in that particular country in order to benefit from it. Okay. So rules of origin are there to ensure that you do not engage in such practices. They ensure that the product is substantially made in the member country. Rules of origin obviously are complex and they are controversial, and as I mentioned earlier, that was one reason why the phase one negotiations. Generally, countries that have weak institutional capacity would want to have simpler rules because they are easier to implement. But the problem with simpler rules is that they are also easier to circumvent. Okay? In other words, you can beat the system. You can overcome the restrictions imposed by the rules. Okay? You can get around them. So there is a trade-off, as you can see. there's a trade-off between effectiveness and ease of implementation. Okay? So if you want rules of effective to be effective, then they may be a bit harder to implement because then the rules become more complex. Generally, the two common methods of determining originating status. So originating status means basically a label that confirms that the product is substantially made in the country from which it claims to be originated. Okay? So there are two methods for determining originating status. One is wholly obtained, and the second one is sufficiently worked in process. Okay? So wholly obtained means like the product is made in the countries, and this applies to mostly raw materials and agricultural products. For example, myself, from Mauritius, we are known to be a major producer of sugar. Okay, and sugar is a wholly obtained product. Okay, because we don't need raw materials imported in order to make sugar. It's very much originating in Mauritius. So most agricultural products basically satisfy this method. They go by this method, only obtained. But other products may be sufficiently worked or processed. So you can imagine, for example, producing a t-shirt. Suppose you have an apparel industry and you produce t-shirts for export. Okay. Now, all the t-shirt requires many things. Cotton, probably to begin with. Okay. Dye, it requires machines and all that. And not all of it is, not all of it originates in the country. Some of what is needed to produce the t-shirt might be imported. Okay. So in that case, you have to make sure that you have used imported inputs, but you have transformed them sufficiently and you have contributed value added. Okay. There's a fairly high degree of value addition that actually makes the product, that actually allows you to claim that the product is locally made. Okay. And sometimes the value addition rule is 35%. Okay. The AFCFTA rules of origin build on the REC level rules. So this is the idea of preservation of the acquis. Okay. So the idea of the acquis, remember, means that you build on what is there already. So there are rules of origin around, and the AFCFTA builds on those rules, and they try to strike a fair balance between effectiveness and ease of implementation, as I said. So there's a trade-off between the two that we need to try. Non-tariff barriers. There's another article dealing with entities. Non-tariff barriers are very important. In fact, tariff rates have gone down across the world and in Africa as well, and they have become less of a barrier to trade, okay, compared to non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers still remain high and pervasive across Africa. Okay. What are the non-tariff barriers we're talking about? We're talking about mainly SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which are non-tariff measures applied mainly to agricultural products. Okay? We are talking about technical barriers to trade, which apply to industrial products. And there's a whole bunch of non-tariff barriers. In fact, the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, okay, has a classification, has established a classification of 7 different groups of non-tariff barriers. Okay. So you may want to check. So the protocol on trade in goods gives attention to eliminating non-tariff barriers, and the focus is on such barriers, as I mentioned, such barriers as technical barriers to trade and SPS. Article 13, which is the article about non-tariff barriers, requires state parties to prepare time-bound non-tariff barrier elimination. Each country is required to prepare an NTB elimination plan, which makes it clear. So it sets out a sort of a timeline. Okay, by this year you will do this. By this year you're going to do this, and so on and so forth. Okay? And all of this will be monitored. And they are also required to set up an NTB coordination unit, which will be the EFC target, and the NTB coordination unit will report on progress in removing non-tariff barriers level of 9. So there is a follow-up of the process level of the situation. There is another article dedicated specifically to trade facilitation. Trade facilitation, as we know, refers to all that has to do with eliminating and facilitating. It's about facilitating customs procedures and practices. It's about cutting away documentary requirements by customs. It's about really facilitating trade and transport arrangements and countries. The customs remain rather poor in terms of sophistication. Okay? Documentary, also you need so many different documents, and sometimes the business community asks whether all those documents are okay. And it turns out, in fact, there are some documents that are really redundant. Okay, so trade facilitation is all about cutting away layers of red tape. It's all about simplifying the business. It's all about making the administration, the customs administration, more efficient, more nimble, okay, so that they can clear goods faster, whether for export or for import. And this is very important, especially when you are exporting perishable goods. Okay? Perishable goods cannot be held, while you are doing so many checks. Okay? Every day matters. So trade facilitation is all about expediting customs clearance. So it's defined as the implementation by border agencies of the provisions relating to trading goods. There are 3 annexes to the AFCFTA protocol on trading goods that deal with trade facilitation. Annex 4 in particular is consistent with the WTO trade facilitation. Okay. The TFA. As we know, the TFA was agreed at the Bali Ministerial Conference in 2013. There are, in terms of African countries that have signed the agreement, there are 35 of them. Okay? 35 African countries have signed the agreement. 35 out of 44. Okay, so as you can see, there are countries that need still to ratify the agreement. Okay? So the 35 countries I mentioned actually the countries that have ratified the agreement. Okay? So out of the 44 countries that are members of the WHO, only 35 have ratified. So as you can see, some countries still need to ratify the agreement. So we have to push it at the level of the WTO itself. The trade facilitation agreement was presented as an agreement that is very much in the interest of developing countries, and in particular, the least developed countries, because it will help them really make their customs more efficient. But there was a bit of reticence on the part of developing countries. So the trade facilitation component of the protocol on trading goods in the AFCFTA is a softer version of the WTO trade facilitation. Okay. So you may ask how much it will achieve at the end of the day, and that remains a question. So time will tell. The next article I want to talk about is about trade remedies. Okay. So trade remedies, as we know, are allowed in the event of whenever there is a situation where imports can cause injury to local industry. This may happen. There are three different cases when this can happen. One is when there is dumping. Okay? So dumping would mean, goods are being imported into the country at a cost which your local industry cannot compete with. Okay? So that is dumping. The other one is when a foreign country is using subsidies and the export of that country is therefore they benefit from what we may call an unfair advantage because they've been subsidized. So obviously, your local industry will find it hard to compete with subsidized imports. And finally, the case of import surges. Okay, so an import surge would mean that there is a sudden increase in imports, and that again can cause a lot of damage to your local industry. The term we use is injury. Injury to your local industry. And in that case, you want to protect your local industry by imposing what are called safeguard duties. In other words, you may raise import duties, you may impose what we may call remedial duties in order to curb. So in the case of dumping, you want to impose what is called anti-dumping duties. In the case of subsidies, you use what are called countervailing duties. In the case of import surges, you may use what are called remedial tariffs or safeguards. So the AFCFTA agreement allows for trade remedies. The protocol on trading services, which is the next big protocol. Trading services are okay. Let's move to the protocol on trading services. Trading services are an important area for Africa. Sometimes when we talk about trade, we can inevitably to focus on trade in goods, or what we call merchandise trade. But services trade are very important, and they're becoming even more important as many countries are becoming more and more digitally ready. Okay? As you know, there are many services that are traded through the internet, what are called IT-enabled services, or ITES. Okay, a lot of them, back office operations or medical transcripting. I mean, So many of these different services are call centers, okay, also, okay, which are happening because they have been made easy as a result of developments in the technology, especially use of the internet. Trading services are very important. Okay, services are important, especially because we don't realize that the production of many goods actually require services inputs. Okay. There is a database now that is published by the WTO, which is called the TIVA database, the Trade in Value Added database, which basically shows trading services, maybe in terms of value added, it may account for 50% of value added. In fact, much more than its actual volume of trade. Okay. Why? Because, as I said, the production of many goods incorporates services. Very interesting. I want to share this with you. There was a study by the Fung Global Institute, okay, which is a think tank based in Hong Kong. And they studied the value chain of a bakery, okay, the value chain of making bread. Now, bread is a very simple product, okay, very unsophisticated product. We all use it. We just take it for granted. Okay? Have you ever imagined the value of bread, what it consists of? Well, this is what the Fung Global Institute tried. They took the value of bread and they broke it down into what are the contributing elements. Okay? So obviously, to make a bread or to make a loaf of bread, you need, the basic ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast. Okay, you need a machine, you need power, you need storage, you need labor, you need transportation, you need all of that. Yeah. So when they broke down the value of a loaf of bread, they found, and this is the interesting part, they found that up to 75% of the value of the bread was actually services. So this was not the flour or the water or the yeast, okay, or labor. It was services. Okay. So sometimes services are actually embedded in the production of goods, and this is something that we tend to skip. Okay. So services are very important. They are important not only in their own right, but also because services are embedded in the production of goods. But despite the importance of services in African economies, trade in services remains low on the continent. Trading services by African countries generally remains low. And in particular, intra-Africa trading services is even lower. There is no precise data on it, but the fact remains that trade in intra-Africa trading services is rising. There are pervasive barriers to trading services, which restrict foreigners' access to the domestic service market. For example, in many countries, the telecommunication sector is not open to investment. The port is not open to investment. So there are many such service sectors which are not open to foreigners. So you want to retain control of those service sectors. So long as this is the case, then what happens is that your service sector will not grow. Because let's face it, especially in Africa, we need in many areas, we need foreign investment, not for its own sake, but because foreigners come with their own technology, the kind of technology that many African countries are lacking. The protocol on trading services seeks to enhance the competitiveness of the service sector in Africa by liberalizing services and by fostering foreign investment in the services. I think I need this. So, without fostering foreign investment in the services sector, Africa may not be able to develop the potential of this. The protocol aims to create a single liberalized market for trading services, and it seeks to do this through first a protocol for the progressive liberalization of the service sectors, and second, through a framework of common disciplines. Common disciplines meaning disciplines that all countries agree. So these could be disciplines regarding domestic regulation, how to regulate service sectors, mutual recognition, for example, government sectors. For example, when people move, one kind of service, for example, is professional service. Okay, so consultants, for example, when they move from one country to provide their services in another country. Question is, do you recognize the qualifications of that profession? Okay. In many countries, as we know, for example, lawyers, they have their own recognition, they have their own sort of, in my country, for example, you have an order of lawyers, okay? You have a council when it comes to medical doctors, okay? So question is, if you have a medical degree in one country and you want to practice in another country, will your qualifications be recognized in the other country? So this is the question of mutual recognition. And I hope you can understand why the lack of mutual recognition can be a barrier to trade. In this particular case, a barrier to trading professionals. The protocol is generally in the spirit of the WTO GATS. GATS stands for the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which is obviously the WTO agreement. So it basically goes and follows the spirit of the agreement. As far as the AFCFTA is concerned, member countries will be able to complement, in fact, their commitments, the commitments they have made in the AFCFTA with common regulatory cooperation frameworks in certain sectors. For example, in the transport sector, you have the Single African Air Transport Market in the aviation sector. So in addition to commitments they might have made in the protocol on trading services with regard to the aviation sector, this particular agreement, this particular cooperation framework can also be something additional. We can also follow what this cooperation framework allows them to do. The protocol on dispute settlement. Okay, dispute settlement is very important, as you know, when it comes to trade under an agreement, because conflict may arise for whatever reason, and you need to be able to resolve such conflict. And it is therefore the role of a dispute settlement body to look at any such dispute and to make a ruling. So the protocol on rules and procedures on the settlement of disputes provides for the administration of the dispute settlement mechanism established as per Article 20 of the AFCFTA. So it basically administers the dispute settlement mechanism. It ensures transparency, fairness, predictability, and consistency of the dispute settlement process. So we want to make sure that if ever there is a dispute, if ever there is a conflict, and that matter is brought to the dispute settlement mechanism, that the ruling is transparent, is the working of the dispute settlement mechanism is transparent, its ruling is fair, there is predictability and consistency. The protocol provides for the setting up of a dispute settlement body. So it's like a court, basically, which will be responsible to take up the case and to make a ruling. And it empowers the dispute settlement body to set up an appellate body. So if ever the DSP, the dispute settlement body, delivers a verdict and the party is not happy with the verdict, it feels aggrieved, it can take the matter further to an appellate body and ask the appellate body to review the decision. Okay. So the appellate body handles grievances around. So this is very much along the lines of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. In fact, the AFCFTA DSP is fashioned, it's modeled on the WTO DSM. Protocol on free movement of persons. Now, free movement of persons, people is obviously very high on the Africa's integration region. Okay, we cannot talk about the continental integration if people cannot move from one country to another relatively free. Okay. So why do we want to promote free movement of people? It comes with several advantages. Okay. It leads to an optimal allocation of the skills across borders. It boosts regional tourism. It promotes economic growth, and it also contributes to remittances. Okay. So I think the first part is very important, optimal allocation of skills across borders. In some countries, for example, there's a shortage of medical doctors. In other countries, there might be surplus medical doctors who are not able to find a job. So if you allow these surplus medical doctors from one country to move to another, it really leads to an even and optimal allocation of the skills. And that contributes to greater efficiency across the country. When it comes to promoting free movement of persons, Africa's progress is mixed. Different countries, different regional economic communities have achieved different dreams. At the level of the regional economic communities, the EAC, the East African Community, and ECOWAS actually are the champions of free movement of persons. They are far ahead compared to the other regional economic when it comes to promoting free movement of persons. SADC and COMESA are less successful, despite having adopted protocols to promoting free movement. In the AFCFTA, regarding the AFCFTA, as I said, we have a protocol relating to free movement of persons, right of residence, and right of establishment, which was adopted by the AU member states in January 2020. But then this is separate from the AFCFTA. Okay. So the negotiations leading to the protocol on free movement of persons were carried out separately from the negotiations about the AFCFTA. So there are two separate processes, but then at the end of the day, we view the protocol on free movement of persons as an important part of the overall AFCFTA. This protocol will support establishment of the AFCFTA and facilitate transition towards an African economic community. Because, you know, an African Economic Community would allow not just freedom of movement of goods, of services, of capital, but also of people. Okay? So it's very much part of the big picture. The protocol urges member states not to discriminate against nationals of other member states entering the country. So the whole principle of non-discrimination. So you should allow other nationals nationals of other African countries to enter into your country, obviously subject to the proper documentary requirements. In the area of mutual recognition, the protocol aims to establish a continental qualifications framework. So as I explained, it's very important that qualifications obtained in one country are recognized in another country, especially when it comes to professional qualifications, and to that effect, the continental qualifications framework is. On the whole, however, the protocol is rather soft in its overall tone. It doesn't push. It's not very pushy. It's not forceful. It tends to be soft. And when it comes to such a protocol, some people might be wondering whether it will really achieve much. Okay. For example, it contains no provisions related to this. Visas, as you know, remain an important issue. There are some countries that do not require a visa. There are other countries that will deliver you a visa on arrival almost automatically. But then there are many other countries where obtaining a visa still remains a problem. And you know what happens is, you know, sometimes it creates grounds for corruption. You want to bribe the officials into giving you a visa, and it really opens the doors to corruption. So that is one problem. Another problem is that the protocol remains evasive when it comes to mutual. Yes, it talks about the continental qualifications framework, but much needs to be. And we're going to end with this slide. How are the various protocols of the AFCFTA agreement in line with the WTO? I think it's very important that we have such alignment, because at the end of the day, 44 African countries are also members of the WTO. Okay? And they already are implementing various WTO agreements. So we don't want to see a situation where implementing a WTO agreement in a particular area conflicts with their commitments under the AFCFTA impact. Okay? So they must be aligned, they should complement each other, there must be consistency. Okay? And this will ensure that you can then implement both your WTO agreements and your AFCFTA agreements without any confusion, without any problem. So the AFCFTA agreement can also benefit the non-member countries. I mean, the WTO non-member countries. Okay? There are 9 countries, okay, 9 African countries that are currently negotiating accession to the WTO. So, if these countries are implementing the AFCFTA agreement, and if the AFCFTA agreement is modeled on WTO agreements, it means that they are already being accustomed to the WTO rules and regulations. So when it comes to negotiating accession, it makes the process easier. Okay? They can actually convince the WTO that they are already implementing several of the rules and regulations that the WTO is about. Okay? And they are doing it at the level of the continent through the AFCFTA. So the institutional arrangements under the AFCFTA also mirror the corresponding WTO agreements. As I mentioned, for example, the DSP, the Dispute Settlement Body, or the Dispute Settlement Mechanism generally under the AFCFTA is modeled on the respective dispute settlement mechanism in the. Now, theoretically, regional trade agreements such as the AFCFTA contradict the MFN and national principles of the WTO. As you know, the MFN principle is that we should treat all countries equally. Essentially, this is what it means. Okay, you should treat them equally. But then, when you are in a regional trade agreement, you give a special favor to member countries that you do not give to countries outside of the trade bloc. So in a way, when you look at this, it appears like it's a contradiction of the MFN principle, the MFN clause. Okay? But in fact, the WTO allows for certain exceptions to the MFN clause. Okay? And therefore it allows regional trade agreements to be concluded and to be notified to the WTO. And there are three articles that actually allow RTAs to be formed and to be notified. The first is GATT Article 24, which provides that the RTA covers substantially all trading deals. In other words, it allows for an RTA to be formed provided that the RTA achieves a substantial degree of trade liberalization. How substantial? Well, as I said, we have come to understand it to be 90%. Okay? 90% on that. And then there is GATS, the General Agreement on Trading Services. So this one is specific to services. Article 5 of GATS provides that the conditions of substantial sectoral coverage and absence of elimination of substantially all discrimination in relation to trading services. So when it comes to trading services, that you eliminate substantially all discrimination and that you achieve a substantial degree of sectoral coverage. If you do that, then your services trade agreement would be compliant with GATS Article 5. And finally, the enabling clause. Okay, the enabling clause allows for flexibility to developing countries when it comes to the WTO countries. Okay? So you can actually establish an RTA under the enabling clause if you are a group of developers. So here we are. We have reached the end of the 7th module. A lot of ground has been covered in this module. We talk about the different protocols that constitute the agreement, the AFCFTA agreement, the first phase of the negotiations. So the protocol on trading goods, the protocol on trading services, the protocol on dispute settlement, and then another protocol which is sort of annexed to the agreement, not really an integral part of it, in a way. That is the protocol we as of now, only 22 countries have signed that protocol. So as you can see, there is very little interest in the protocol. But it's considered to be important, especially in the next stage, especially when you're moving to the single market. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the merge. Thank you.